Some names enter history like a scream. Sarah Granger's arrived like a whisper that refused to die. Even decades later, in the dusty courthouses of the old Oklahoma Territory, men would lower their voices when speaking of her, as though her very memory might still shift the air. They never said her name loudly. They never said it without caution. Because Sarah Granger was not merely a woman, she was a disruption, a question, a wound in the legal imagination of a land built on certainty. Court records from those early frontier years tell of her as though describing a weather phenomena, force unpredictable, a presence unsettling. Between 1847 and 1856, she stood trial not once, not twice, but 4 separate times. Each trial for the same extraordinary charge, grievous assault upon her lawful master, and each time, despite evidence so explicit that women and children were ushered from the room before testimony began, no jury convicted her. A few whispered that witchcraft must be involved. Others believed she had discovered some ancient and private calculus of anatomy that men preferred not to contemplate. 3 plantation owners lost their ability to father children after crossing her path. A 4th lost something even more delicate, the steadiness of his mind. The official record softened the language to severe trauma requiring medical intervention. But the truth moved through the territory like wind through tall grass. Sarah Granger cut men in ways they never recovered from. Everyone knew what she had done, everyone, but no judge wished to be the one to pronounce a sentence upon her. The farther one traveled from the heart of the territory, the stranger the story sounded as though the frontier had exaggerated another myth. But within those counties, Fort Gibson, Muskogee, Tahlequah, the name Sarah Granger carried a weight that bent conversations around it. What power could compel a legal system built upon absolute dominance to release its most dangerous captive? Again and again, to answer that, one must begin not with the crimes, but with the woman. SARIH The question of what made Sarah Granger was never fully answerable by sight alone. Those who saw her, whether briefly or unwillingly, described her later with a mixture of confusion and respect. She was small, just over 5 feet tall, with hands that should have been too delicate for the fields that had claimed most of her 32 years. Her skin bore the familiar markings of plantation life, but one scar stood apart. A narrow, pale line tracing from her left temple down to her jaw. The overseer who had struck her at 14 had meant to shame her. Instead, he had given her a signature, one that witnesses would recall long after her death. But it was not the scar they remembered. It was her eyes. They did not look downward. They did not plead. They did not shrink. Her eyes weighed people, measured them, memorized them. She carried knowledge in her gaze, and that alone troubled men who expected obedience from silence, not intelligence. Sarah was born in 1824, on a tobacco plantation in northern Alabama, the daughter of a woman whose name the ledger ignored. Her first master, Edmund Hartwell, was described in paternal terms by neighbors. The way men often defended their cruelty by calling themselves reasonable. He fed his workers adequately. He punished only when drunk. He allowed marriages between those he owned, as though granting a privilege that belonged to them in the first place. Sarah learned to read in stolen moments. Through a thin crack in the schoolroom wall, she watched Hartwell's young daughter trace letters across her slate. Sarah memorized each shape, each sweeping line. She learned the alphabet the way other children memorized lullabies, by heart, by rhythm, by repetition. This hidden education would later save her life. When Hartwell died in 1842, the debts he had buried beneath card tables and whiskey bottles resurfaced with astonishing speed. Sarah, age 18, young, strong, and literate, dangerously literate, was sold for $850 to a cotton trader named James Wickham. She was separated from her mother and her 2 brothers in a single afternoon. The only home she had ever known became a memory she learned to fold inward, like a letter that could not be read too often for fear of tearing. The journey west into Oklahoma Territory took 6 weeks. She rode, chained, in a wagon with 11 others, watching the world widen from the green slopes of Alabama to the long, treeless plains that stretched into distances no one could imagine belonging to. The Territory Oklahoma in 1842 was a place caught between sovereignties. It was officially Indian Territory, though white settlers were arriving by the dozens each month, dragging behind them not only wagons and dreams, but the entire machinery of plantation life. Creek and Cherokee families farmed the land beside Presbyterian missionaries, beside federal troops, beside planters fleeing exhausted soil in the east. The legal system existed in overlapping jurisdictions that often contradicted one another. What was a crime in one courtroom became an unquestioned custom in another. Within this unsettled world, Wickham's plantation sat 20 miles south of Fort Gibson, 300 acres, 42 enslaved people, 7 wooden cabins, and 1 overseer whose cruelty seemed honed into habit. His name was Walter Pute, a man who believed that discipline was a craft and pain, its most dependable tool. 20 lashes for speaking during work, 34 leaving the fields, 54 striking back. Punishments were performed at sundown on Saturdays, a ceremony of terror meant to keep the soil watered with obedience. Sarah survived by observing. Always observing. She learned who could be trusted, who traded information for scraps of favor, and which nights Wickham visited which cabins. She learned that his wife, Charlotte, drifted through life accompanied by the soft fog of laudanum and Chopin, and that Pute's cruelty had predictable rhythms, as though even violence required a calendar. Sarah carried all this knowledge quietly, storing detail upon detail the way other women stored scraps of cloth for future mending. It would all matter. Every observation, every Tuesday night, every rule, spoken or unspoken. Because in late November of that year, her 5th month on Wickham's land, the inevitable happened, and Sarah Granger changed the course of the Oklahoma Territory forever. The night the silence broke, Tuesday nights carried a peculiar stillness on Wickham's plantation, a silence so deliberate it felt curated, as though the air itself had learned to anticipate what might happen after dark. The wind quieted. Even the animals seemed to withdraw into themselves. The women in the cabins knew this quiet intimately. They had shaped their breathing around it, had trained their bodies to mimic sleep the moment a shadow crossed the doorway. Sarah noticed early on that Tuesday held a different texture. She learned to recognize the slight shift in mood at sunset, the way shoulders tightened, the way conversations thinned. No one said the reason aloud. Naming danger was a privilege they didn't have. By late November, Sarah had observed enough to understand that Wickham's nocturnal visits followed a pattern as predictable as the phases of the moon. She also understood more deeply than anyone suspected that waiting for mercy was another kind of slow death. That night, just past 10, Wickham stepped into the cabin. He didn't need a lamp. He knew the path too well. The door creaked softly, and the women on the pallets held their breath with such practiced precision that not even fabric rustled. Their silence was a reflex. An armor as thin and necessary as skin. Wickham smelled of whiskey and pomaties to comforts, mixed with the damp chill that clung to his coat. He moved through the cabin with the confidence of a man entering a room full of furniture, not people. When he reached Sarah's pallet, he paused. Perhaps he expected trembling. Perhaps he wanted it. Sarah lay still, awake, but her stillness was not submission, it was calculation. He bent slightly, his shadow spilling across her like a dark tide. When his hand touched her shoulder, she did not recoil the way others had. She spoke. Her voice was so soft that the women 2 feet away barely heard it. And yet it carried the weight of a declaration. "I'll kill you if you touch me again." He laughed. Of course, men like Wickham always laughed when threatened by those they believed powerless. It was a short, almost affectionate sound, as if she had offered wit rather than warning. His hand drifted from her shoulder to her throat, not squeezing, merely laying claim. A gesture, a promise, a reminder. What happened next occurred so quickly that time itself seemed to stumble. Sarah's hand emerged from beneath her blanket with something metallic glinting in the dim cabin. Light, a small cotton knife, stolen 2 weeks earlier with the quiet inevitability of someone arranging survival. There was a sudden, swift movement, a break in the stillness. A wet, shocked exhale from Wickham. Half gasped. Half collapsed, he staggered backward, hitting the wall hard enough to rattle the boards. His hands flew to his trousers, where warmth spread with terrifying speed. Blood darkened the fabric before he could even comprehend the injury's shape. Sarah Rosenach rushed, not frantic. She stepped around him and walked into the November night with the dignity of someone leaving a completed task. Behind, she still held the knife, her breath misted in the cold air. As she crossed the yard toward the main house, the night seemed to widen around her, the sky stretching like a witness. She climbed the steps and knocked on the door, as calmly as if bringing a message from the fields. Charlotte Wickham answered. She was fully dressed, as she often was at such hours, her eyes unfocused from laudanum and a deeper kind of exhaustion. Behind her, the faint strains of Chopin drifted through the hallway. Sarah extended the bloodied knife. "Handle first. Your husband tried to force himself on me," she said evenly. "I injured him. He's in cabin for... You'll want a doctor." Then she sat on the wooden steps and folded her hands in her lap, and she waited, not for pardon, not for justice, but for the consequences she had already measured and accepted. Dr. Theodore Gaines was roused from bed near midnight. He rode through 12 miles of freezing darkness to reach the plantation. When he arrived, Wickham lay half-conscious, pale, bleeding, and ashamed in a way men of his standing rarely were. Charlotte played the same nocturne downstairs, repeating the same measure as though the keys themselves might steady the house. Sarah sat outside on the porch, hands still folded, her expression unreadable. Gaines would later write in a journal never meant for public eyes that the cut had been astonishingly precise, too clean, too deliberate, too anatomically informed to be anything resembling panic. He wondered, privately, who had taught her such accuracy. He wondered, too, what desperation shaped such skill. Wickham survived, but altered in a way that stripped him of the authority he had once carried with ease. The injury was recorded in the official documents as severe trauma to the gentleman's person, a phrase chosen to hide the reality that Sarah had removed both testicles with surgical finesse. From that moment onward, no one overseer, master, or visiting planter laid a hand on Sarah Granger. Fear is, after all, sometimes its own form of law. And yet, despite the whispered outrage and the official procedures, the question that tormented the territory was not what she had done, that it was what to do with her. Because the law was clear, and yet the law had never imagined a woman like Sarah. He first trialed the morning after the incident moved through the territory, like a rumor searching for a resting place. People whispered before breakfast, before church bells, before the sun had fully risen. It was not the violence that shocked them. Violence was a common, expected currency in their world, but who had enacted it, and upon whom by the time a deputy arrived at Wickham's plantation, the story had already outpaced him, galloping from porch to porch in careful, half-fearful, retellings. Sarah offered no resistance when she was taken. She stood when asked, walked when told, spoke only when necessary. Her demeanor unsettled even the deputy, who found himself glancing at her out of the corner of his eye as though her silence might suddenly break into something more dangerous. At the Fort Gibson courthouse, Judge Samuel Greenidge sat behind his desk, reading the preliminary report with a tightening jaw. He had presided over countless strange cases. During his career frontier, justice was nothing if not inventive, but this one demanded a level of introspection he had not anticipated. Slave who struck her master was to be executed. A slave who permanently injured her master was to be executed without delay. The law left little room for interpretation, but this case brought to his desk something too sharp to be handled by legal text alone. He summoned Sarah for a private interview before the trial, a courtesy irregular, but not forbidden. What passed between them in that dim courthouse chamber was never officially transcribed. What is known comes from the recollection of his clerk years later. When he described the conversation with the reverence of someone recounting a haunting, Sarah answered every question with calm precision. Yes, she had taken the knife 2 weeks earlier. Yes, she had anticipated needing it. Yes, she had intended to damage Wickham's ability to harm anyone else. No, she felt no remorse when he asked why she had chosen such a specific punishment. Her answer chilled him so deeply that he had to steady his hand before writing his notes. Because I wanted to make sure he couldn't do to anyone else what he tried to do to me. There was no rage in her voice, no triumph, only clarity. Greenidge dismissed her gently and sat for a long moment after she left, staring at the closed door as though it might reveal answers. He found none. The courtroom. The trial began the next morning, the courtroom stifling with bodies and tension. Women and children were escorted out before testimony began. The nature of the wound, the clerk announced, made such precautions necessary. Wickham did not appear. He claimed illness, but everyone understood the truth. He could not bear to have his humiliation read aloud in the public record. Overseer Pute testified with the indignant fervor of a man who believed his authority had been personally affronted. He described Sarah as insolent, difficult, prone to disregard the rules. His voice shook with theatrical outrage, revealing more about his pride than his memory. Dr. Gaines followed with a clinical explanation so delicately phrased that it required more imagination to understand than most listeners wished to employ. Charlotte Wickham sat through it all, hands folded neatly in her lap, her face a porcelain mask painted with opium calm. She neither flinched nor looked away. The surprise came when William Harjo, a Creek delegate, stood to speak. His presence was irregular, his authority questionable, but Greenidge allowed him to proceed. Harjo argued that tribal law still recognized in Indian territory considered self-defense a fundamental right, even for those legally enslaved. He spoke plainly, with the blunt honesty of someone accustomed to difficult truths. This woman defended herself from assault, he said. Under our laws, that is no crime. A ripple passed through the gallery. Some scoffed, some shifted uncomfortably, some, quietly, agreed. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. In that time, the judge paced his chambers. The clerk paced the hallway, and outside, a small crowd waited with the anxious energy of a land preparing to choose between law and conscience. When the jurors returned, their faces were pale, their expressions strained, not guilty. The words fell into the courtroom with a weight that felt almost holy. For the first time in the territory's history, a slave accused of permanently injuring her master had been acquitted. Chaos followed. Outrage in the newspapers, letters from plantation owners demanding reversal, sermons warning of rebellion, chaos, and divine retribution. But the verdict stood. And Sarah, still unflinching, returned briefly to the plantation only for Wickham to sell her immediately for $600. Unable to endure the presence of the woman who had undone him so completely. Thus began the second chapter of her legend. The second master, Marcus Sheffield, purchased Sarah Granger with the confidence of a man who believed himself immune to the misfortunes of others. He paid $600, a reduced price justified in the bill of sale by the phrase criminal tendencies, as though violence were a defect of temperament rather than circumstance. Sheffield was, by local standards, a reasonable master, reasonable meaning he attended church, paid his debts on time, and imagined these habits made him righteous. His farm was smaller than Wickham's, 30 miles west. A quiet place with fewer fields, fewer hands, and fewer witnesses. He lived alone, a widower of several years, and though he spoke of remarrying, the women he courted sensed something brittle beneath his politeness, something restless. Sarah arrived on his property with the same unreadable composure she brought everywhere. She took in the landscape, the cabins, the kitchen yard, the barn. She watched the rhythms of the place, the way musicians read a score attuned to every beat, every pause, every dangerous crescendo. For 4 months, nothing happened. Sarah worked steadily, neither friendly nor defiant. She watched, she learned, she planned nothing, not yet. Sheffield observed her cautiously at first, then curiously. His reserve, built on sermons and propriety, began to crack beneath the weight of his own desires. He told himself he was different than Wickham, that he would approach differently, that he would not take what was not willingly offered. Men often told themselves such lies before acting on them, and so, one night almost identical to the night Wickham bled against the cabin, while Sheffield followed the same doomed path. He waited until the property was quiet, until the lanterns were out, until the particular hour when men believed their sins became invisible. He entered the cabin. His presence startled no one. The silence of women forced to bear witness was a learned skill. Sarah was awake. She had expected this long before he understood his own intentions. When Sheffield reached for her, there was no warning this time, no whispered threat, no soft announcement of consequence, that there was only swift, exact, inevitable. The blade she used was not a cotton knife but a straight razor stolen from Sheffield's own shaving kit. She had found it weeks earlier while cleaning the master's bedroom. She had tested its weight. She had sharpened its edge. She had prepared without telling herself she was preparing. The cut, delivered with terrifying accuracy, struck Sheffield with the same stunned disbelief Wickham had felt. He stumbled backward, clutching himself with both hands, his breath collapsing into ragged gasps. Blood darkened the dirt floor. One of the women in the cabin later said she heard him whisper, "God help me," though whether it was prayer or curse, no one could be sure. Sarah stood. She put the razor down, and she waited for the consequences again. The second the second trial drew a crowd large, enough to fill the courthouse and spill onto the steps outside. This time, people came not only for justice, but for spectacle. Sarah Granger had become a symbol of what? No two observers agreed. Some saw her as a monster, a warning of what might happen if the boundaries of ownership faltered. Others, quietly and at great personal risk, saw her as something else entirely, a possibility. Judge Greenidge presided again, his face more lined, his shoulders heavier. He understood that this second case was not merely a repetition of the first, it was an escalation. The territory had tolerated one acquittal. A second would be a statement. The prosecution worked feverishly to condemn her. This time, they pressed harder. They asked sharper questions. They framed her as calculating, malicious, unnatural. Sarah testified. It was the first time she spoke publicly about her life. For 2 hours, the courtroom listened as she recounted her childhood, her sale, the Tuesday night visits, the silences of women too exhausted to defend each other, and the truth she had learned slowly and painfully. That reputation alone did not protect a woman. I thought, she said, turning her gaze toward the jurors, that once a man knew what I was capable of, he would choose differently. I was wrong. The courtroom shifted uncomfortably, as though her calm words scraped against some delicate region of the male imagination. When the prosecutor demanded to know whether she regretted the injury she had inflicted on Sheffield, Sarah answered with the same unshakable composure as before, "I regret that it was necessary. I do not regret defending myself." The line traveled far beyond the courthouse, printed in newspapers from Fort Smith to Richmond, repeated in barrooms and parlors, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with fear. The jury deliberated 11 hours before returning the same verdict, not guilty. Sheffield sold her immediately afterward. Her price dropped again now, $420. Each sale reduced her monetary value while increasing her legend, because by now, the men of the territory understood something they would never say aloud. Buying Sarah Granger was an act of extraordinary courage, or extraordinary foolishness. The third cut Elias Drummond purchased Sarah Granger with the air of a man selecting a tool he believed he understood. He operated a modest cotton gin near the Canadian River. 3 hired men, a small mill, a few acres under cultivation. Compared to the sprawling plantations east of Fort Gibson, his enterprise was almost humble. He considered himself progressive. He allowed his workers to tend small garden plots, permitted marriages, occasionally granted coins for extra labor. These gestures, in his mind, made him benevolent. Men like Drummond often mistook leniency for virtue. He believed he would succeed where Wickham and Sheffield had failed. Sarah arrived, silent and observant. She noted the rhythm of the mill, the structure of the household, the hours Drummond kept. She learned the weight of the paring knife in the kitchen drawer. She learned the soft creak of the master bedroom floorboards. For 9 months, she worked without incident, long enough for rumors about her to dull into background mutterings, long enough for Drummond to convince himself that her past troubles had been exaggerated. He even spoke of her occasionally to visitor Zois with a measured tone, as though describing a horse with a mild temperament if properly handled. But a man's sense of safety can be a fragile thing, especially when built upon the illusion that he is different from other men. The third NIGHT. The pattern was so similar to the previous incidents that even the later trial transcripts expressed an uneasy astonishment. Drummond waited until the cabins were still, until the moon had climbed past the ridge of the trees, until his conscience thin as silk gave way entirely. He entered with quiet steps. The women did not stir. They knew the script. They had seen it enacted too many times to pretend it wasn't happening again. But Sarah was not Wickham's Sarah, nor Sheffield's Sarah, nor would she be Drummond's. When he reached for her, the blade flashed. Small, sharp, honed to surgical precision on the stone at his own mill. What followed was swift, exact, and devastating. The injury was not identical. To the first two, Drummond, unlike his predecessors, would retain some function, though never the ability to father the children he had spoken of only weeks earlier. But the message was unmistakable. Sarah acted not to kill, not to retaliate, but to permanently end his power over her body. When Dr. Gaines, summoned for the third time, arrived to treat the wound, he stared so long at the injury that his assistant murmured a quiet reminder to fetch his instruments. Later, in the private journal, he guarded fiercely. Gaines wrote, "She possesses anatomical knowledge I have not seen outside medical training. How she learned it, I cannot guess." It was not meant as praise, but it read like it. The trial of National ADTNTON. By the time Sarah reached the courthouse again, her reputation had outgrown the territory. Newspapers as far north as Boston printed her name with fascination. Southern publications denounced her as a monster, manufactured by abolitionist lies. Spectators traveled from towns she had never visited. Women sat in the gallery with faces caught between horror and awe. Men folded their arms too tightly across their chests, as if protecting something vulnerable from a truth they did not wish to consider. The prosecution assembled a formidable case. 3 doctors, overseers, plantation owners, even preachers who proclaimed her verdict would determine the moral future of the territory. Judge Greenidge presided once more. Though he looked older, his eyes shadowed, his movements weary, as if the territory's contradictions had settled into his bones. Sarah did not raise her voice. She did not plead. She simply told the truth. The truth, steady and unadorned, carried its own authority. The jury deliberated 15 hours. Reporters waiting on the courthouse lawn described the night as thick with dread. A silence full of teeth, air tightened like a rope around the building. When the jurors returned, they delivered the same impossible verdict, not guilty. 2 jurors would later confess that they believed she was guilty under the written law, but could not bring themselves to invoke that law against her. Something in her testimony, they said, made the law itself seem indecent. A different Eon D&G this time. Drummond did not sell her. He freed her. The manumission papers, filed in December 1851, cited irreconcilable differences in temperament, and included a clause forbidding her from returning to Muskogee County. He paid her $75 in wages, an extraordinary gesture, and arranged for her travel to Fort Smith, Arkansas. Perhaps it was conscience, perhaps regret, or perhaps Drummond understood what Wickham and Sheffield had not. You cannot own a woman who refuses to be owned. Sarah lived quietly in Fort Smith for 3 years. She worked as a seamstress. She learned to read and write with fluency. She attended evening classes taught by a Quaker woman who asked no questions about the past. For a time, it seemed possible she might build a new life untouched by the trials behind her. But history, like a shadow, has a way of following those who carry truth too boldly. Because in May of 1854, without announcement or fear, Sarah Granger walked back across the border into Indian Territory. And she did so with a purpose that would shake the region even more deeply than her first 3 trials. The woman who returned for 3 quiet years, Fort Smith held Sarah Granger as gently as any place could. She worked her needle through fabric, earning enough to rent a small room above a dry goods store. She read books she had once memorized through cracks in a schoolhouse wall. She attended evening classes where her teacher, an elderly Quaker woman named Miss Turner, saw intelligence in her eyes and never asked for the story behind the scar on her cheek. Fort Smith had no reason to fear her, and she had no reason to wound it. It was, for a time, the closest she had ever come to peace. But peace, for certain people, is not a destination, it is a pause. In May 1854, Sarah folded her dresses into a cloth bundle, locked the door of her room for the last time, and walked alone across the border back into Indian Territory. No one knew she was coming. No one expected her return. And yet, some part of the land seemed to recognize her, the way a field remembers the shape of a storm. She walked 43 miles to Fort Gibson, her step steady, her resolve sharper than any blade she had ever carried. She did not come for revenge. She did not come for the past. She came because another woman needed her. H. Her name was Hannah, 19 years old. Small, quiet, with a history written in silences. She had struck her master with a fire poker after he forced his way into her cabin. He survived with a broken collarbone and a humiliation he swore was unprovoked. His testimony, polished and clothed in respectability, claimed he had come only to check on reports of illness. Hannah's version was simpler. He entered the cabin, and she defended herself, but truth was rarely enough to protect women like her. When Sarah arrived at the courthouse and announced that she wished to testify in Hannah's defense, the room erupted in alarm. Not fear of her violence, no, they understood that now. Fear of her voice. Judge Greenidge, now 63 and growing visibly weary of the contradictions of the world he presided over, initially refused. She was not a witness to the event, he argued. She has no legal standing. But Sarah had anticipated this. She opened a bundle she carried close to her chest. Inside were documents for years of letters, testimonies, and accounts from women across 3 territories. All smuggled, all handwritten, all describing violence identical in pattern, nearly identical in circumstance. She had been collecting these letters secretly from the moment she reached Fort Smith. Names changed, faces changed, but the stories were the same. A master entering a cabin at night, a woman forced to pretend she was asleep, the silence that followed, the injury required to survive. Greenidge, trembling slightly, read a handful of the letters in his chambers. When he returned to the courtroom, he made a decision that changed the nature of justice in the territory. He allowed Sarah to speak, not as a witness, not as a victim, but as an expert in the anatomy of self-defense against sexual assault and authority the law had never imagined possible. 3 days of TSTIMO and wife. For 3 days, Sarah stood before the court and described the patterns she had spent years learning. She explained the hour of night when assaults were most common, the excuses men used, the silent warning systems women created among themselves, small taps on cabin walls, whispered signals, patterns of breath. She described the body, not as an instrument of labor but as a battleground of survival. She explained where to strike, how to calculate force, how precision could mean the difference between freedom and retaliation. She spoke without theatrics, without bitterness, without shame. The prosecutor, Harrison Tate, familiar and furious, tried repeatedly to force from her the admission of premeditation. Each time she offered the same quiet, devastating truth: I prepared for the possibility of needing to defend myself. That is not the same as planning to harm someone. Her words carved through the courtroom like a blade slicing fabric. When she finished, the silence that followed felt like something sacred. The VRDICT. The jury deliberated 19 hours. They deadlocked. Some swore they could not acquit. Others said they could not condemn. In the end, they returned not guilty. Hannah wept. Not loudly, just enough for the people closest to her to understand what freedom sounds like when it finally arrives. Outside the courthouse, some men muttered about rebellion. Others tightened their jawlines and avoided one another's eyes. But among the women of the territory, both enslaved and free, Sarah's return sent ripples that would grow into currents. Because now, they knew the truth. The law might not protect them, but knowledge could.
The territory takes notice. It did not take long for the white men of the region to sense an unease they could not name. Overseers began noticing women carrying themselves differently, shoulders straighter, eyes clearer, silences less resigned. Women who once looked away now looked back. A whisper began among the plantation owners, a rumor that tightened their throats, that Sarah Granger had begun teaching others what she knew when the first new injury occurred. A plantation owner in the Arkansas borderlands rendered infertile after entering a cabin unannounced. His neighbors dismissed it as a fluke. When the second occurred, they spoke of coincidence. By the 9th, there was no room left for coincidence. 7 of the 9 injuries were identical, precise, calculated, intentional. Someone had taught them where to strike. The committee formed in late 1854, in a parlor thick with cigar smoke and resentment. 23 plantation owners formed what they called the Territorial Property Protection Committee, a name chosen to disguise fear as order. They hired a lawyer from Richmond, Cornelius Vance, known for prosecuting insurrections with cold efficiency. He was a man who believed the world made sense only when arranged in a hierarchy with himself near the top. His purpose was simple: find a way to destroy Sarah Granger legally, permanently. Vance studied her previous trials. He saw what others had overlooked. She had not acted alone, not anymore. Her influence had become more dangerous than her blade. He knew double jeopardy protected her from being retried for her earlier actions. He knew she could not be charged for teaching literacy. She was free now. He knew the law was not built to silence knowledge. So he searched the oldest, dustiest corners of English common law and found a weapon: conspiracy to commit mayhem, a charge so obscure most judges had never heard of it. A charge so flexible it required no direct action, only the sharing of knowledge that led to injury. Knowledge, in Vance's eyes, had become a crime. The fourth trial begins in August 1856. Sarah stood in the courtroom for the fourth time, not as a slave, not as a victim, not as a defendant in an act of personal defense, but as the alleged architect of a movement. The courtroom filled to suffocation. Federal marshals stood guard. Spectators crammed against windows. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing they were witnessing history, though what kind, no one could yet decide. The prosecution called 17 witnesses. Men injured, men angry, men afraid. Overseers who claimed they saw Sarah meeting with women who later defended themselves. Even a woman who, under pressure or fear, claimed Sarah had given explicit instructions. The weight of testimony was monstrous. Yet, even as accusations piled like stones, Sarah stood with the same stillness she always carried, the stillness of someone who had already measured the cost of truth. By the end of the first day, it was clear this trial was not about her acts. It was about her influence. She had not acted alone, not anymore. Her influence had become more dangerous than her blade. He knew double jeopardy protected her from being retried for her earlier actions. He knew she could not be charged for teaching literacy. She was free now. He knew the law was not built to silence knowledge. So he searched the oldest, dustiest corners of English common law and found a weapon: conspiracy to commit mayhem. A charge so obscure most judges had never heard of it. A charge so flexible it required no direct action, only the sharing of knowledge that led to injury. Knowledge, in Vance's eyes, had become a crime. The fourth trial begins in August 1856. Sarah stood in the courtroom for the fourth time, not as a slave, not as a victim, not as a defendant in an act of personal defense, but as the alleged architect of a movement. The courtroom filled to suffocation. Federal marshals stood guard. Spectators crammed against windows. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing they were witnessing history. Though what kind, no one could yet decide. The prosecution called 17 witnesses. Men injured, men angry, men afraid. Overseers who claimed they saw Sarah meeting with women who later defended themselves. Even a woman who, under pressure or fear, claimed Sarah had given explicit instructions. The weight of testimony was monstrous. Yet, even as accusations piled like stones, Sarah stood with the same stillness she always carried. The stillness of someone who had already measured the cost of truth. By the end of the first day, it was clear. This trial was not about her acts. It was about her influence. It was about knowledge, and knowledge, uncontrolled, terrified them. The archive that terrified them. The turning point of the fourth trial did not come from testimony, nor from Sarah's quiet strength, nor even from the furious precision of Cornelius Vance's questioning. It came from a discovery that prosecutors believed would crush her forever. While searching the small boarding room where Sarah had lived, investigators found a trunk inside where items that, under different circumstances, would have been objects of scholarship, carefully preserved, meticulously organized, astonishing in their detail. But in this courtroom, they were treated as contraband. Vance displayed them with the theatrical flourish of a man revealing a weapon: 47 letters, 6 journals, pages of diagrams, lists of names, dates, injuries, verdicts, 14 detailed accounts of assaults, 3 years of correspondence among enslaved and free women across 5 territories. He laid them out before the court like evidence of treason. The room fell silent. Even Judge Greenage, experienced in contradictions and sorrows, flinched at the sheer volume of Sarah's record. Sarah had not merely taught women to defend themselves. She had documented everything. Not rumors, patterns, not incidents, cases, not whispers, testimony. She had created a map of the unspoken violence across Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, and beyond. A map men were never meant to see because it revealed the truth they had buried beneath law and property. That the violence they considered private, natural, inevitable was in fact systematic, and that women, quietly, carefully, dangerously, had begun to understand themselves not as isolated victims, but as part of a pattern. Patterns could be defended against, systems could be challenged, knowledge could be shared. This was what terrified them. Vance's closing argument. Cornelius Vance held up a journal, his fingers pinching it as though it might stain him. "This," he thundered, "is not self-defense. This is organization. This is teaching. This is strategy." He lifted another page. An anatomical drawing, sketched with careful lines and notes detailing angles, weaknesses, points of leverage. "This is war," he said, "and she," he pointed directly at Sarah, "is its architect." The words had weight, heavy, brutal weight, the gallery murmured, some in horror, some in admiration, some unable to decide which emotion was safer. Vance believed he had broken her. He believed he had exposed the full extent of her threat. He did not understand that truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. The women in the gallery sat straighter. Something had been named aloud that had long existed, only in silence. The defense rises. Sarah's lead attorney, Robert Chenoweth, a young man with a sharp mind and a sense of justice inherited rather than learned, stood for his closing argument. His voice was quiet, so quiet the room had to lean forward to hear him. "You have heard a great deal about conspiracy," he began, "a conspiracy that requires no secrecy, no weapons, no meetings in the night." He held up one of Sarah's letters. "This is not a call to rebellion. This is documentation of suffering. And suffering, gentlemen, cannot be made illegal simply because it embarrasses those who cause it." He turned slightly toward the jury. "You heard Mr. Vance call this war. I call it survival. Sarah Granger did not create the need for this knowledge. The need existed long before she was born." He paused, letting the silence settle. All she did was refuse to let the truth die with her. The jury's impossible task. The jury deliberated for 4 days, 4 days in which Fort Gibson held its breath, 4 days of tension so thick soldiers patrolled the courthouse steps, 4 days in which men whispered that the territory itself hung in the balance, 4 days in which women prayed, not for acquittal, but for clarity. Judge Greenage, knowing he was nearing the end of his life, spent those days writing a letter to his daughter, the last document his hands would ever sign. He was found dead in his chambers before the verdict returned. The shock rippled through the territory. A judge who had wrestled with contradictions now escaped them forever. When court resumed under Judge Patterson, the jury filed in with hollow eyes. The foreman's voice trembled. Not guilty. But he continued, an unprecedented act. We cannot criminalize the teaching of self-defense. We cannot condemn knowledge. The sentence had no legal authority, but its moral weight reshaped the room, and afterward, the territory would never quite be the same. The knowledge that would not die. The fourth acquittal struck Oklahoma Territory like a stone thrown into still water. Waves radiated outward, rippling through communities, unsettling the ground beneath both law and custom. Plantation owners reacted first, quietly, tensely, with a fear they refused to name. The newspapers were less subtle. Some editorials condemned the verdict as a sign of moral decay. Others called Sarah Granger proof that leniency led to rebellion. A few, very few, suggested the legal system itself had been cracked open, revealing something rotten beneath. The Territorial Property Protection Committee issued no formal statement, but its members moved through the town like men carrying a shared wound. They watched their workers more closely. They locked their doors. They lowered their voices when speaking to one another, and while many believed that a not guilty verdict had set Sarah free, the truth was more complicated. She walked out of the courtroom, yes, but she walked into a territory forever altered and still dangerous. The shared silence of women. In cabins and cramped quarters, in kitchens and root cellars, women spoke her name in whispers. Sarah Granger. Her again? She came back. She taught them. She told the truth. For some, her story was a lifeline. For others, a spark. For all, a shift in the world's balance. Sarah herself moved through Fort Gibson with the calm of someone who had long expected the cost of knowledge. She continued working as a seamstress, continued attending church, continued writing letters that traveled through secret paths of trust. The documents discovered by Vance had been only a portion of her archive. She had distributed the rest long before the trial. Bundles of letters lay hidden beneath church floorboards, buried in garden plots, wrapped in oilcloth inside creek council houses. Copies were carried to Arkansas, Missouri, and eastern Texas, tucked into hymnals, sewn into quilt linings, slipped beneath loose boards in mission schools. Sarah had built her archive the way one plants seeds across a landscape, never knowing which will take root, only that some must. Knowledge, she understood, survives by multiplication. The shift in the territory for men in power, the trial had exposed an unbearable truth. Women were learning from one another. If one woman defended herself, it was a crime. If two did, it was coincidence. If dozens did, and in the same precise manner, it was a movement, though no one dared call it that aloud. Some men demanded new laws restricting the movement of enslaved women. Others called for curfews, for cabin inspections, for harsher punishments. But something had changed irreversibly. Fear no longer traveled in only one direction. The price of knowledge. Sarah understood she would not be allowed to continue indefinitely. She had felt it for months, like a storm building behind mountains. So she prepared. She taught 3 women, two formerly enslaved, one freeborn, to take her place. Each learned how to record dates, distinguish rumor from fact, protect correspondents' identities, store letters safely, recreate documents if confiscated, and most importantly, how to share knowledge discreetly. Sarah taught them the way she had been forced to learn, methodically, quietly, with a kind of patience born from necessity. She never used the word successor. She never spoke of a movement. She simply ensured the work would not die with her. The territory, however, had no intention of waiting for a fifth trial. The last strategy of the system. In December 1857, two federal marshals arrested Sarah Granger on a charge so thin it would have been laughable if it were not so cruel: mail fraud. They claimed she had used the postal system to distribute content dangerous to public order, a flimsy pretext, a bureaucratic trap, a legal noose that avoided the moral questions her previous trials had forced into the open. Sarah recognized the strategy the moment the charge was read. They would not try her for violence. She had defeated that. They would not try her for conspiracy again. It had failed spectacularly. They would not try her for teaching. It was not prohibited by law. They would try her for paperwork, because paperwork required no moral reckoning. The fifth verdict, Judge Patterson conducted the new trial with the rigid impatience of a man uninterested in complexities. He barred discussions of assault, banned references to prior cases, and insisted the issue was simple: whether Sarah had violated federal postal regulations. It took the jury 40 minutes to return a verdict: guilty. She was sentenced to 18 months in federal detention at Fort Leavenworth, followed by permanent exile from Oklahoma Territory. As marshals led her from the courtroom, Sarah turned to the watching crowd and said, clearly enough for all to hear, "They can exile one woman. They cannot exile the knowledge I have shared." The words settled over the room like dust. Quiet, inescapable, permanent. The prison of stone and silence. Fort Leavenworth, in the winter of 1858, was a place built not for punishment alone, but for forgetting. A military installation first, a federal prison second, its stone walls seemed designed to erase identities as efficiently as they contained bodies. When Sarah arrived, shackled in a wagon beside 3 other prisoners, the air carried the iron taste of deep winter. Snow clung to the creases of the limestone buildings. Wind hummed through the courtyard like a hymn sung without faith. The women's section of the prison had once been nothing more than a storage facility. It still felt like one. The walls sweated moisture in the cold months, making blankets perpetually damp. The wooden platforms that served as beds were narrow and infested with insects. The air never truly warmed. The light, what little there was, filtered in through windows placed too high to see out of. The cruelty here was not personal. It was architectural. The routine of disappearing days in the prison were built on ritual, not mercy. Wake at 5:30. Breakfast of cornmeal mush. Laundry work from 7 until noon. Wool uniforms, heavy coats, linen soaked in hot water that scalded bare hands until they cracked and bled. Lunch of bean soup and bread. More washing, more wringing, more carrying. Dinner at 6, lights out at 8. Sunday changed only by requiring 2 church services, one in the morning, one at dusk, doubling the hours of being lectured on repentance by a chaplain who never named the sins of the men who had filled this prison. The work destroyed the hands of every woman there, including Sarah's. Within weeks, her palms were a map of split skin, but she bore the pain with the same reserve she carried into every trial. Survival, for her, had always been a discipline. The women of Fort Leavenworth. Prisons create their own society, their own hierarchies, their own weather. The inmates fell into three quiet categories: the unfortunates, women imprisoned for theft, prostitution, or poverty; the dangerouses, those convicted of murder, unpredictable and solitary; the politicals, those whose crimes carried meaning beyond themselves. Sarah belonged to the third group, a category carved into existence solely because she stood in it, but she did not behave like a figure of legend. She scraped laundry, she obeyed orders, she kept to herself unless spoken to, yet women gravitated toward her with questions that no chaplain, no guard, no official could answer. How do you endure? How do you hold on to who you are? How do you survive something designed to break you? Sarah answered with the same steady wisdom she had brought to the cabin floors and courtrooms. Count days if it helps, don't count them if it hurts. Be invisible when it protects you. Be visible when it protects others. Write down what you want remembered. Memory is its own defiance. She never mentioned resistance, but something in her presence made others straighten their backs. The letter that slipped through. In March, after 2 months in confinement, Sarah received a letter, smuggled, coded, brief. It came from Elizabeth, one of her 3 successors, the women she had trained quietly, carefully, with the understanding that her time might be cut short. The letter said only, "The garden you planted continues to grow. We have harvested seeds and replanted them. Your work lives." Sarah read the message 3 times, holding it in hands cracked from work and cold. Then she fed it to the laundry room's coal stove, watching each line vanish into ash. She did not need a keepsake. She needed only the knowledge that the archive, her true legacy, was alive. The beginning of illness, spring arrived, but the stone walls held winter's dampness like a grudge. Sarah's cough began as a softness in her throat. Nothing unusual in a place where steam, cold, and exhaustion rubbed against one another constantly. But by April, the cough deepened. By May, it shook her body. By June, fever flickered through her like a candle never allowed to go dark. She continued working anyway. Stopping would invite punishment, and the guards rarely distinguished between illness and unwillingness. Only Mrs. Hale, the matron assigned to oversee the women's ward, noticed the growing frailty in Sarah's movements. She mentioned it once to a guard, then quietly took it upon herself to watch Sarah more closely, not out of sentiment, but out of a respect earned slowly and unwillingly. By November, the cough had settled deep into her lungs. Breathing became a negotiation, standing, a determination. Sleep, a battlefield between fever and exhaustion. On November 8th, Sarah collapsed at her laundry station. Dr. Richardson examined her with the clinical resignation of a man who had seen too many preventable illnesses become fatal. "Pneumonia," he said, "likely for some time." He recommended rest, warmth, and better food, 3 luxuries the prison did not provide. She was moved to the infirmary. She lay in a narrow bed near a window that leaked both air and light. And there, for the first time in her life, Sarah Granger began to drift. the edges of the world softening, her memories merging with her dreams. The last letters. The infirmary at Fort Leavenworth was a single long room with 6 beds, arranged like punctuation marks in a sentence of suffering. The walls, though cleaner than the laundry house, still held winter's chill. The air smelled faintly of lye, damp wool, and the slow, sour breath of fever. Sarah's bed stood nearest the window, a mixed mercy. The draft worsened her chills, but the light, thin and winter pale, gave her something to look toward when her breathing became difficult. For days she drifted in and out of consciousness. At times she was lucid, aware of the world with painful clarity. At others she slipped into fevered dreams that carried her backwards through the years. She dreamed of her mother, face blurred by memory, voice preserved only in the echo of lullabies she couldn't quite recall. She dreamed of the cabin where she had first understood violence. She dreamed of the scar on her cheek, the one that had made people believe she had known defiance before she could speak it. She dreamed of the fields, of Wickham's breath, of Sheffield's eyes, of Drummond's trembling hands. Those memories no longer hurt her. They simply passed through her like visitors in a house she was preparing to leave. The chaplain, Reverend Blackwell, visited her more than once, though his sermons, soft, apologetic, filled with talk of repentance, had little hold over her. On his last visit, Sarah found enough strength to speak. "Have you ever wondered," she whispered, "if what you call sin is simply refusing to participate in someone else's wrongdoing?" Blackwell swallowed, uncomfortable. "The scriptures teach—" "Scriptures were written by men," she interrupted gently. "Men who never sat in a cabin waiting for footsteps that meant harm." The chaplain left early that day. He did not return. The fever breaks, briefly. On the first morning of December, Sarah's fever eased. Just a little, enough for her to sit upright, enough for her to feel the weight of her remaining breath. She asked Mrs. Hale for paper and ink. It was an unusual request for a dying inmate, but something in Sarah's voice, quiet, steady, certain, made refusal difficult. Mrs. Hale brought the materials and stood near the bed, pretending not to watch as Sarah began to write. Her hands trembled, her breathing labored, but the words came anyway. The first letter to Fort Gibson. The first was addressed to the women who had supported her, sheltered her, trusted her. Do not let silence reclaim what we have learned. Knowledge survives when shared, not when hoarded. Remember that what we built was never meant for one life alone. The second letter to her successors. The second letter was for Elizabeth and the other 2 women who had taken up her work. You know what must be preserved. Keep copies, hide them well, teach others when they are ready. Not all will be choose with care. The archive is stronger than any single woman, stronger than me, stronger than the law that seeks to bury us. The third letter to a judge's daughter. The third letter was the longest, addressed to Judge Breenage's daughter in Philadelphia. In it, Sarah wrote, "Your father tried to hold justice and law in the same hand. Few men ever attempt it. Fewer succeed. Tell your children he once chose conscience over convention. Tell them he recognized humanity where others saw property. Tell them that matters." She folded the pages carefully, sealed them with shaking fingers, and handed them to Mrs. Hale. Whether Hale mailed them or not is lost to history, but decades later those letters resurfaced in archives, proving that someone, whether by duty, sympathy, or defiance, had carried Sarah's words into the world. The final night. On December 2nd, the fever returned like a tide reclaiming the shore. By evening, Sarah could no longer sit up. Her breaths grew shallow, her lips cracked, her eyes bright with the clarity of someone who knows the body is letting go. 2 women were with her at dawn, the one with tuberculosis, and Mrs. Hale, who had stayed the entire night though she was not required to. As the light crept through the window, pale and cold, Sarah whispered her last words, so soft they almost vanished into the air. The work continues, and then she was gone. The woman. They tried to bury Sarah's death was quiet. Her burial was quieter still. Fort Leavenworth wasted no sentiment on inmates, dead or living. She was placed in a simple wooden coffin, carried not by mourners but by assigned guards, and taken to the prison cemetery on the eastern edge of the grounds. There were no flowers, no hymns, no family, only a thin winter wind that moved the dry grass and whispered across the land she would never see again. Reverend Blackwell read a standard burial prayer, one he had spoken so many times that the words no longer belonged to anyone. He noted in his journal later that she died without repentance for her crimes, but added, almost reluctantly, and without bitterness. When the coffin was lowered into the ground, a simple stake was hammered into the soil. 1858, 117, meaning the 117th prisoner to die that year. No name, no marker, no record, just a number. They believed this anonymity would finish the task the court could not, making her disappear. The news travels home 2 weeks later. A military courier delivered prison notices to Fort Gibson. Among them was a single-line entry in the territorial newspaper. Sarah Granger, convicted of mail fraud, deceased December 3rd at Fort Leavenworth. No causes, no details, no acknowledgement of who she had been. But in the kitchens, in the cabins, in the corners of marketplaces where women gathered to buy or trade essentials, the news traveled differently. They said, "She's gone." She's really gone? God keep her. She taught us. She didn't leave us empty-handed. She left us knowing. Some cried, some prayed, some simply sat in silence, absorbing the weight of what she had done for them, but none of them forgot. The men of the territory. For the men who had feared her, the reaction was more complicated. Among plantation owners, relief mingled with something tighter, sharper. Unease. Death had taken her body, yes, but it had not taken the changes she caused. The Territorial Property Protection Committee expressed satisfaction, though their letters hinted at lingering doubt. Cornelius Vance, the man who had finally secured her conviction, wrote to a colleague, "The Granger issue has resolved itself naturally, but I fear her influence may linger longer than we wish." He was more right than he understood. What happened next? Sarah's death did not slow the spread of her teachings. It accelerated them. Her 3 successors, Elizabeth and the 2 unnamed women, began working with renewed urgency. They traveled, corresponded, and continued documenting assaults with a precision Sarah would have admired. Within 18 months, the archive had grown larger than it had ever been during Sarah's life. Letters arrived from Arkansas, Missouri Indian Territory, northern Texas, eastern Tennessee. Women who had never met Sarah began sending their stories, trusting the unseen network she had built. Some wrote their names, some did not. All understood that being remembered truthfully was its own form of resistance. The first backlash. In April 1859, authorities intercepted a packet of letters traveling between Fort Smith and Little Rock. The letters contained detailed accounts of assaults, exactly the kind of documentation Sarah had encouraged. 5 women were arrested for seditious correspondence. Their trial became a sensation, but the prosecutor's attempt to use Sarah's legacy against them failed in a way he had not foreseen. Every letter, every testimony, every injury they had documented was now entered into the public record newspaper's printed excerpts. Readers saw patterns. The silence around these abuses cracked. The 5 women were convicted, but received reduced sentences, only 6 months in county jail. Even the judge admitted, the circumstances deserve the attention of lawmakers. It was not justice, but it was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement was the first victory Sarah had never lived to see. The woman they could not erase. By the end of 1859, one truth had become clear. The attempt to imprison her voice only amplified it. Her death, meant to close a chapter, instead opened 100 doors. The archive grew. Her teachings spread. Women remembered her face, her voice, her quiet conviction. Men remembered her precision, her defiance, the way she made judges hesitate. Sarah Granger had died in an unmarked grave, but her influence walked freely through the living. The work continued, just as she said it would. The legacy that outlived the war history has a way of losing people, especially women who were not meant to leave a record. But Sarah Granger had spent her life making sure that forgetting her would not be easy. By 1860, her archive lived in 6 hidden places: church basements, creek council houses, the trunks of traveling seamstresses, beneath loose floorboards in schoolrooms. The network she built was scattered and quiet, yet astonishingly organized. And yet, quietly, stubbornly, Sarah Granger's archive refused to vanish. The documents she left behind did not live in museums or libraries. They lived in trunks, in family cupboards, in folded papers placed inside Bibles, in sealed envelopes tucked inside cedar chests where women kept the secrets their daughters were too young to understand. Most people forgot the details of her trials, but the documents remained. They traveled in strange ways. The documents on the move. In 1904, a house fire in Tahlequah burned through 2 trunks of records, yet a packet of Sarah's letters, hidden inside a hymnal, survived untouched. In 1909, a schoolhouse in Fort Gibson collapsed during a storm. When teachers salvaged books from the wreckage, they found 3 folded pages marked in a delicate hand. To protect ourselves, we must first tell the truth about what was done to us. The paper had yellowed, the ink had faded, but the meaning remained sharp. In 1912, a seamstress in Muskogee died at age 87. Her granddaughter found, sewn into the lining of an old quilt, a small notebook filled with copied correspondence from the 1850s. She didn't know who S.G. was, but she kept the notebook anyway, sensing its importance. Pieces of Sarah's life drifted from woman to woman, year to year, kept not because they understood their full significance, but because something in those words resisted disposal. It was as though the archive had a will of its own. The era of erasure. The rise of Jim Crow brought a different kind of violence, one aimed at memory itself. In this new order, the old stories of resistance became dangerous to keep. Many families hid documents more carefully. Some buried them, some burned them, weeping because survival demanded it, and yet, not all were willing to let history be rewritten in the language of men who never suffered. A few kept the papers in safe hiding. A few told their daughters quietly. This belonged to a woman who did not bow. A few insisted, "For now, keep this secret. One day, someone will need to know." This was how Sarah survived, through whispers, precautions, stubborn mothers, and daughters who refused to let truth dissolve. The Scholar's Return. By the 1930s, a new generation of historians began to revisit the stories of Black resistance. The lost cause narrative, though still powerful, was beginning to face cracks, small fractures created by scholars unwilling to accept a sanitized past. Some remembered Hutchinson's 1893 article. Others stumbled on stray references in court records. A few found fragments of her letters in academic archives, misfiled or mislabeled. A researcher in Chicago discovered a bundle of her writings attached to a Presbyterian missionary report. Another in St. Louis found a copied diagram of defensive injury targets folded inside an agricultural journal from the 1880s. A graduate student in Kansas uncovered a letter Sarah had written from prison, hidden inside a soldier's personal papers. They pieced together these fragments like archaeologists reconstructing a shattered vase. Something began to emerge, a picture of a woman not merely resisting violence, but documenting an entire system, interpreting it, countering it, teaching others to survive within it. Historians realized what earlier generations had refused to see. Sarah Granger had been writing history long before anyone realized they should be reading it. The survival of memory. What kept her alive was not legend, not myth, not folklore. It was documentation. The same weapon she had used against the system that sought to own her. Even when her body lay in an unmarked grave, her handwriting lived. Her diagrams lived. Her letters lived. Her reasoning lived. The questions she asked continued echoing long after the men who had feared them were gone. By mid-century, scholars began to name her openly again. Small footnotes, brief mentions in essays, citations to Hutchinson's article, references to the Granger documents, whispers of an early archive of resistance. She was returning slowly, quietly, with the same calm inevitability she had shown in life. Because some stories do not stay buried, some truths do not decay. Some women leave behind a map others cannot help but follow. And Sarah Granger, unbowed, unmarked, unforgotten, was one of them. The rediscovery. By the mid-20th century, a quiet revolution was unfolding in American scholarship, a revolution led not by the traditional architects of history, but by the women who had long been denied the right to write it. African American women historians, librarians, teachers, and archivists began searching for the stories that had been erased. They sifted through county records, church basements, abandoned schoolhouses, and dusty trunks passed through generations. And slowly, piece by piece, Sarah Granger came back into focus. The first scholar to speak her name aloud in 1948, a young black historian named Dr. Lillian Carter, a professor at Howard University, was researching early legal resistance by enslaved women. She was one of the first scholars to refuse to accept the narrative that enslaved women were helpless victims. During research in Oklahoma archives, Carter stumbled upon a worn folder labeled simply, Territorial Court Records, Miscellaneous. Inside she found clippings of newspaper accounts from Sarah's third and fourth trials, a partial transcript from the 1856 conspiracy case, 2 unsigned letters copied by hand, a medical note written by Dr. Theodore Gaines describing precise injuries. Carter froze. She had heard whispers of a woman who defended herself with surgical precision. Now the whispers had a name. For the first time in decades, a scholar wrote Sarah Granger's full name in her notes, not as legend, not as rumor, but as subject the rediscovery had begun. The women who followed the thread. The true revival of Sarah's story did not come from universities alone. It came from communities, especially black women in Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Kansas, who carried the memory even when they didn't know the full story. Church secretaries who refused to throw away old papers, librarians who rescued boxes from destruction during renovations, teachers who saved diaries found in condemned schoolhouses, elders who recalled the trials that made men tremble. In the 1950s, a librarian in Fort Smith discovered a quilt with a pocket sewn inside, pages copied from Sarah's journals. She mailed them to Dr. Carter, unsure of what she had found. Carter recognized the handwriting immediately. More fragments emerged. A diagram of anatomical weak points, a list of court dates, letters documenting women injured by visits at night, an unfinished essay titled On the Matter of Survival. The archive was no longer scattered. It was awakening. The Granger collection takes shape. By 1962, scholars and community researchers had gathered enough documents to form what they called the Granger collection. It included letters from enslaved women across 5 territories, Sarah's trial notes copied by unknown hands, accounts of assaults and legal outcomes, testimonies of self-defense, maps of early black settlements, medical diagrams, transcripts of abolitionist speeches referencing her case, and portions of Sarah's own journals, once believed lost forever. No one had a complete set, but together they formed something astonishing, a record created not by the powerful, but by the powerless refusing to be erased. It was one of the earliest collective human rights archives in American history, and it had been built by enslaved women. The first publication. In 1965, Dr. Carter published a groundbreaking article titled, They Defended Themselves, The Early Legal Resistance of Enslaved Women in Indian Territory. 2 entire sections were devoted to Sarah Granger. The article sparked debate. Some scholars claimed Carter exaggerated the trials. Others insisted documentation from enslaved women could not be trusted. A few called Sarah a violent anomaly, but there were also those who recognized what Carter had uncovered. A black historian in New York wrote, "This is the first time we have seen a detailed resistance archive created by enslaved women. This is not anomaly. This is pattern. This is truth. The conversation, once forbidden, was finally public. The rise of a symbol. By the 1970s, as feminist and civil rights scholarship gained ground, Sarah's name began appearing in women's studies courses, in legal history seminars, in footnotes about resistance, in anthologies of Black women's narratives, in sociological studies of violence and agency. Her legacy shifted from local legend to academic subject, from courtroom controversy to historical evidence, from buried truth to emerging symbol. She was not portrayed as a saint, not as a villain, not even as a simple hero. She was portrayed as what she truly had been, a woman who refused to surrender her body, and then refused to let anyone silence the record of that refusal. Her archive became a cornerstone for new generations of scholars studying gendered violence, legal resistance, self-defense law, enslaved women's intellectual history, and the hidden networks of knowledge in oppressed communities. Her story shaped the way scholars understood the past, and still, the archive grew. The unfinished puzzle. By the end of the century, historians estimated that perhaps 60% of Sarah's original archive had been found. The rest remained missing, lost in fires, hidden in attics, buried in forgotten trunks, or protected by families who still feared the consequences of revealing their histories. But the puzzle was no longer broken. It was simply incomplete. And scholars kept searching, because some stories refuse silence, some maps still lead somewhere, some names demand to be spoken, and Sarah's was a name that carried the weight of truth. The law remembers her slowly. By the late 20th century, Sarah Granger had traveled far beyond the cabins, courthouses, and cold stone cells where her life had unfolded. She had entered a different kind of arena, one that moved slowly, cautiously, and often reluctantly. The realm of law. She became a question whispered in legal seminars, a case study in feminist jurisprudence, a phantom footnote in debates about self-defense, bodily autonomy, and the ethics of survival under oppression. The courts had tried 4 times to define her. History tried for more than a century to forget her. But now, slowly and with hesitation, the law began acknowledging her, not directly. No modern ruling bore her name. No Supreme Court justice quoted her letters. But the questions she forced into existence, questions men in power once fled from, now became unavoidable. The first time her story was taught in a law school, it happened in 1979 at a women's legal history seminar at UC Berkeley. A young professor named Dr. Marianne Fletcher had assigned her students to analyze early American cases involving women's self-defense. In a packet of supplemental readings, almost overlooked, was Hutchinson's 1893 article. A student, half bored, half curious, raised her hand. "Professor, this woman castrated 3 men, and juries acquitted her. Why?" Fletcher paused, then smiled slowly. "Because law breaks when it collides with humanity." From that day forward, Sarah Granger became a recurring example in Fletcher's teachings. A case showing that self-defense is not limited to the moment of violence, but begins in the long, invisible years leading up to it. The students were startled, some horrified, some inspired, but none were indifferent. The shift in self-defense theory. In the 1980s and 1990s, Scholars studying domestic violence, marital rape, and gendered self-defense began citing Sarah's trials, not as precedent, but as proof. Proof that violence against women was systemic, survival required preparation. The law had always struggled to account for coercion without bruises. Juries sometimes understood what judges and statutes did not. A feminist legal scholar wrote in 1993, Sarah Granger's acquittals demonstrate an early intuitive grasp of coercive environment defense, a principle not formally articulated until more than a century later. She was no longer a footnote, she was an argument. The rise of public interest. By the end of the 20th century, Sarah's name had crossed into the broader cultural imagination. No longer confined to archives and academic journals, documentaries referenced her. Local museums included her in early territorial exhibits. Writers of historical fiction borrowed pieces of her story, sometimes clumsily, sometimes respectfully. But the biggest shift came from Black women writers, poets, playwrights, essayists, who found in Sarah a lineage of defiance rarely preserved in written form. Some called her an ancestor of resistance, others a ghost who refused silence. One scholar described her as the unacknowledged architect of survival strategies women still use today. The debate about her violence. Not everyone agreed on how to interpret her. Some said she was too violent to be embraced. Others said she was not violent enough to be revolutionary. Some feared romanticizing her. Others feared ignoring her, but the debate proved her relevance. Silence is the fate of the forgotten. Argument is the honor of the remembered. An ethicist wrote, whether one condemns or celebrates Sarah Granger, one must face the world that created her, and that is the point. The academic consensus emerges by the 1990s, a slow consensus formed among historians and legal scholars. Sarah Granger was not the exception to slavery. She was the evidence that enslaved women analyzed power, adapted to danger, developed strategies, communicated those strategies, and documented their lives with archival precision. This ran contrary to decades of portrayals emphasizing passivity or silence. Sarah proved something else. Enslaved women were thinkers, organizers, archivists, and when necessary, tacticians. Her archive became central to a growing understanding that resistance was not rare. It was simply rarely recorded. The return of her name. By the turn of the millennium, Sarah Granger had entered university syllabi, legal theory texts, feminist scholarship, Black women's history, abolitionist studies, human rights analysis. She became part of discussions on coercive control, bodily autonomy, justified force, the law's failure to protect women. One scholar summarized her impact. She reminds us that self-defense is not a moment, it is a lifetime. And yet, she remained incomplete. Even as her reputation grew, her story still felt fractured. Some letters were missing, some cases underdocumented, some testimonies lost to fire, fear, or time. But the shape of her life was clear enough. A woman who refused to be owned, then refused to be forgotten, then refused to let others be invisible. She was not a heroine in the comfortable sense. She was a reckoning, and as the century closed, it became clear. the world had finally begun to understand the magnitude of what she had done, the return to public memory. By the early 21st century, Sarah Granger had traveled a remarkable distance, from an unmarked grave in a prison yard to the edges of national conversation. Her name, once spoken only in whispers or buried in archives, began to appear in places she could never have imagined. Not everywhere, not loudly, but persistently. History had finally begun to turn and face her. The first documentary in 2003, a small independent filmmaker released a documentary titled Territory of Silence. One section, just 11 minutes long, focused on Sarah. The filmmaker interviewed descendants of women who had preserved fragments of her letters. He showed photographs of the prison cemetery at Fort Leavenworth. He traced the timeline of her 4 trials, her archive, her imprisonment. It was not a large production. It did not win awards, but it aired on regional public television. And for the first time in more than a century, thousands of people heard her name aloud. Sarah Granger. For some, it was a revelation. For others, a shock. For a few, a homecoming. The emergence of new scholarship. In 2008, a young historian named Dr. Kira Madsen published a book titled A Map of Survival: The Secret Archives of Enslaved Women in the American Territories. Half the book was dedicated to Sarah's work. Madsen argued that Sarah's archive represented one of the earliest survivals of collective documentation by oppressed women, an unprecedented record of sexual violence from enslaved voices, a strategic network that resembled modern human rights reporting, a legal and intellectual movement hidden within domestic spaces. Her conclusion startled reviewers. Sarah Granger was not an anomaly. She was the visible peak of an invisible mountain. The book won awards. Universities added it to reading lists. New scholars entered the field inspired by what they read. The story continued to spread. The first public memorial. In 2012, a small museum in Muskogee County unveiled a modest exhibit titled Women of the Territory. In a glass case at the center of the room, behind protective glass, were 3 original documents. A letter written by Sarah from Fort Smith, a list of trial dates copied by Elizabeth, and a fragment of anatomical notes believed to be in Sarah's hand. Beside the display was a simple inscription. She taught women to defend themselves when the world refused to defend them. Visitors stood in silence before the case, not because they knew the whole story, but because they sensed the gravity of the woman behind the ink. Some cried, some whispered prayers, some simply stood still, absorbing the weight of a life once nearly erased. The rise of public interest. By the mid-2010s, Sarah's story began appearing in podcasts, museum panels, historical magazines, online articles about forgotten women in history, college courses on gender and resistance, genealogy forums searching for the unnamed women she helped. Her name, once suppressed for fear of the questions it raised, was now raised precisely because people wanted to understand those questions. Writers called her the first self-defense theorist of the enslaved South, a woman ahead of the law, a defender of the defenseless, a historian trapped in a world that hated record-keeping, the quiet ancestor of the eager Me Too. But those who knew her full story insisted on something more precise. She was not a symbol. She was a strategist, a thinker, a recorder of truth, a student of harm, a teacher of survival, and above all, she was accurate. Her documents had proven that again and again. The debates continue. As her story became more public, so did the arguments. Some said she should be celebrated. Others worried about glorifying violence. Some questioned whether she should be taught in high schools. Others argued her story was essential to understanding American history. But debate is not erasure. Debate is survival. And in every argument, Sarah's name lived. The 21st century reframes her. Modern scholars now view Sarah through lenses unavailable in her lifetime. Trauma theory, gendered violence studies, coercive control law, intersectional feminism, historical resistance networks, grassroots archival practice, restorative justice frameworks. Each field found something in her story. Lawyers saw a challenge to old definitions of self-defense. Historians saw a hidden movement. Feminists saw an early theorist of bodily autonomy. Archivists saw a precursor to community documentation. Sociologists saw the anatomy of resistance. Sarah Granger no longer belonged solely to the 19th century. She belonged to every century that valued truth. And still, her story is not finished, because even now, in the present day, researchers believe many letters remain undiscovered. Genealogists suspect hidden family stories. Archivists search for missing journals. Women in Oklahoma still whisper about ancestors who learned from her. And occasional discoveries, an old note, a folded page, a misplaced document, continue to surface. Sarah's life was short, her death was quiet, her grave was unmarked, but her legacy is still being written. The questions she left behind. By the early decades of the 21st century, Sarah Granger had become something rare, a historical figure reclaimed not by accident, not by academic fashion, but by necessity. Her story emerged exactly when the world needed it, when people were finally willing to confront truths long avoided, when silence no longer protected anyone, when the old boundaries between victim and survivor, justified force and criminalized resistance, had blurred into untenable lines. And the more scholars studied her, the more they realized something extraordinary. Sarah Granger had been asking, in 1850, the same questions modern society still struggled to answer. Yeah, the questions that outlived her. How do you prove danger that leaves no bruises? When does self-defense begin? In the moment of harm, or in the years of terror before it? What does justice mean for those the law does not protect? What happens when the system itself is the threat? How many women must be harmed before a pattern becomes undeniable? What is resistance when violence is not rebellion but survival? Sarah had no formal education. She had no legal training. She had no platform, no vote, no protection. Yet she understood these questions intuitively and documented the answers in letters, journals, diagrams. She had built the earliest known map of gendered harm in the territories. Modern activists recognize this instantly. Legal scholars recognized it reluctantly. Historians recognized it gratefully. And still, the questions remained heartbreaking in their relevance. The archive as a warning. As more pieces of the Granger collection were digitized and analyzed, scholars began to see patterns even Sarah herself may not have fully grasped. They noticed similarities in language used by injured women, repeated descriptions of night visits, consistent strategies of silence enforced through fear, identical defensive injuries across multiple counties, a shared calculus of danger learned through generations. It was not merely an archive of violence. It was an archive of patterned terror, the kind that shapes entire communities in silence. A sociologist wrote, "Sarah Granger's archive is not a record of isolated events. It is a blueprint of systemic abuse." Another wrote, "She was documenting the invisible architecture of oppression." In this way, the archive functioned as both mirror and warning, a record of what had been and a reminder of what could be again if forgotten. The Granger Symposium in 2021, a university in Oklahoma hosted the first ever academic gathering dedicated to Sarah Granger. The auditorium filled with historians, feminist legal theorists, archivists, Black studies scholars, descendants of the women whose letters had formed the archive, and 3 representatives from the AME Church where many documents had first been hidden. The symposium opened with a simple statement from the keynote speaker. "We are here today because one woman refused to let truth remain unspoken." Presenters discussed the legal implications of her trials, the anatomy diagrams she left behind, the gendered terror of frontier slavery, community networks of resistance, and the ethics of preserving archives created under unimaginable duress. One panelist, a legal scholar from New York, said, "Sarah Granger forces us to reconsider what self-defense means. She forces us to ask whether survival itself can be criminalized." Another, an archivist, said, "Every page she preserved was an act of rebellion," and in the closing remarks, a descendant of a woman Sarah once corresponded with stood before the crowd and said, "My grandmother used to say, there was once a woman who taught us that fear is not the end of the story. For years we did not know her name. Now we do." The modern struggle to frame her. Even now, scholars debate how to categorize Sarah. Was she a vigilante, a proto-feminist, a resistance strategist, a historian, a legal philosopher trapped in an illegal body? In truth, she was all of these, and none fit her fully. Some critics argue her violence should not be celebrated. Others say refusing to acknowledge her violence is itself a political erasure. Still others insist that the very question misunderstands the world she inhabited, a world where violence was the language of survival. One writer put it plainly, "Sarah Granger was not born dangerous. The world made her dangerous, and then punished her for learning its lessons too well." The ancestor of record keepers. Perhaps the most profound modern recognition of Sarah's impact comes from archivists, who increasingly view her as an early practitioner of community-based documentation. One curator at the Smithsonian wrote, "She may be the earliest known Black woman archivist in the United States. She was not collecting stories, she was preserving evidence." Her meticulous recording of dates, injuries, patterns, and verdicts resembled human rights documentation, domestic violence case building, sociological field notes, legal defensive strategy. She did not know these disciplines existed, yet she anticipated them. She understood that what is not written can be denied. What is denied can be repeated. And what is repeated becomes normal. Her archive was an act of defiance against forgetting. And still, the work continues. Libraries continue searching for lost letters. Archivists restore damaged documents. Genealogists uncover new connections. Historians reevaluate old assumptions. Activists cite her in conversations about bodily autonomy. Lawyers reference her in debates on coercive control. Artists create portraits imagining the face behind the scar. Writers speak her name where silence once lived. She is not a myth. She is not a symbol untethered from reality. She is a woman whose life, brief, brutal, brilliant, rewrote the boundaries of what survival could look like. And history finally is catching up. History rarely grants closure. More often, it leaves us with fragments, loose ends, unanswered questions, echoes of voices that deserved more time, more space, more breath. But in the case of Sarah Granger, something extraordinary happened. A woman the law tried to silence, a woman history tried to bury, a woman society tried to forget. Refused erasure not through monuments, not through textbooks, not through institutional preservation, but through the persistence of truth carried by those who recognized its worth long before scholars did. The grave with no name. Her body rests in a mass grave at Fort Leavenworth, a patch of land marked only by a vague stone, a number lost in a list of the forgotten yet of all the people buried there. Hers is the name the world remembers. The absence of a marker has become, ironically, its own monument. People visit the grounds knowing they stand near the remains of a woman whose influence stretched far beyond her years, far beyond that prison, far beyond the narrow space her captors believed would contain her. The soil holds her bones, but not her legacy. The legacy she never saw the world she left in 1858 was not kind to women like her, but the world she shaped, quietly, indirectly, insistently, looks different. She helped create it, not through revolution, not through laws, not through armies, through knowledge, through the belief that truth must be recorded, even when recording it is dangerous, through the understanding that silence protects only those who harm, through the idea, radical for her time, that women's experiences were worthy of documentation, preservation, and transmission. Today, scholars speak her name, students write theses about her, activists cite her in discussions of bodily autonomy, archivists treat her papers as sacred foundational artifacts, women read her letters and feel her courage reach across generations. The system that tried to break her inadvertently made her immortal. The questions that still stand in modern debates about justice, Sarah's shadow lingers. What does self-defense mean for someone who has never been safe? Where does survival end and resistance begin? How many times can a woman be told her suffering is invisible before she finds a way to make it undeniable? What happens when the law criminalizes protection but excuses violation? These questions troubled juries in 1850. They trouble courts today. They trouble anyone willing to confront the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the law is not the measure of justice, but the barrier to it. Sarah understood this intuitively, precisely, dangerously, and she forced others to confront it. The work continues in church basements, in museum archives, in digitized collections, in private family boxes. Her papers are still being found. Archivists say more of her letters may exist, Genealogists suspect descendants of the women she helped still carry oral histories. Scholars believe more diagrams, more journals, more testimonies remain hidden somewhere. And every time one fragment surfaces, Sarah's story expands. Not like legend, but like light creeping into a room long kept dark because her archive was never finished. Her project was never complete. She knew this. That's why she trained others. That's why she duplicated records. That's why she distributed copies across territories. That's why her final words were not fear, nor regret, nor apology. The work continues. Sarah Granger was not a symbol of purity. She was not a moral lesson carved into a single line. She was not a saint, nor a monster, nor a myth. She was a woman who lived in a world built against her and refused to disappear inside it. She defended herself. She defended others. She documented what the world insisted should remain unseen. She transformed survival into testimony. She carved truth into paper when truth was treated as contraband. Her story is not tidy. It is not comfortable. It is not easy. That is why it matters. Because the past is not made of clean answers. It is made of people like her, who confront brutality with clarity, who face impossible choices, who resist in ways history often refuses to celebrate. And because Sarah reminds us of a truth we are still learning, some stories do not need monuments. They simply need to be told and remembered. In the end, what survives of Sarah Granger is not her body, not her trials, not the fear she inspired in men, nor the fury she survived from the courts. What survives is her written world, the one she forged in secret, the one she scattered across states, the one that outlasted the empire that tried to erase her a world of testimony, a world of pattern, a world of survival, a world of women refusing silence, a world that says even now, even here, she lived, she resisted, she remembered, and so do we.